She was 41 years old, and by the spring of 1887 she owned nothing in this world but a tin trunk, a wool coat gone thin at the elbows, and $11 folded into a handkerchief. Her name was Adeline Marsh, and it was her late husband's brother, a man named Corwin Marsh, who had inherited the family's freight business upon his brother's death, who had put her out of the house she had lived in for 9 years, telling her plainly that a widow with no children and no claim on the estate was a mouth he did not intend to feed. She left with what she could carry, and for 3 weeks she rode and rode again until she came to a half-forgotten crossroad settlement in the Wyoming territory called Bitter Fork, where the bank was auctioning off a debt-ridden trading post that had sat boarded and silent for going on 6 years. Nobody else raised a hand for it. She paid $11 for the whole of it, the building, the land, and whatever remained inside, and the men gathered the courthouse steps locked behind their gloves and called it the saddest purchase Bitter Fork had seen in a decade. What none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know as she turned the rusted key in that door for the first time, was that behind the old counter at the back of that trading post lay something sealed away that would not only save her from ruin, but would restore to an entire forgotten town the one thing it had quietly lost long before she ever arrived. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Marsh. If you are watching this from a place that feels forgotten too, a town passed over, a home left behind, a life that others have written off, tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Adeline had been born Adeline Voss in 1846, in a river town in Ohio where her father kept a modest dry goods store, and her mother took in mending to stretch the family's thin margins. She was the third of 5 children, and from the time she was old enough to reach the countertop, she was put to work weighing flour and counting change, and it was in that cramped store that smelled of coffee and lamp oil that she learned the 2 things that would carry her through the rest of her life. The first was arithmetic, real practical arithmetic, the kind that let her tally a ledger in her head faster than her father could find his spectacles. The second, and this her mother taught her more than her father did, was that a thing's worth was never quite the same as its price, and that the wisest people in any town were usually the ones nobody thought to ask. Her mother would send her to sit with old widow Pruitt down the lane, a woman everyone else considered half-mad and wholly useless, and Adeline would come home with more good sense in an afternoon than she'd gotten from a month of schooling, because widow Pruitt had once kept books for 3 counties before her mind, and her fortune had both been taken from her by men who found it convenient to say she'd lost them herself. When Adeline was 19, she married a young freight agent named Thomas Marsh, a steady, quiet man with an easy laugh and an honest hand, and together they moved west, first Missouri, then further still, following the rail lines and the promise that always seemed to sit just past the next horizon. Thomas was not a wealthy man, but he was a careful one, and for 18 years they built a modest, contented life together, first in a rented room above a stable, and later in a small frame house that Thomas's brother Corwin had helped them finance, a kindness that Corwin would remind her of bitterly and often in the years to come. Adeline never bore children, a private grief she carried quietly and without complaint, and instead she poured the fullness of her attention into her husband's small freight and forwarding business, keeping his books, corresponding with his shippers, learning every corner of a trade that most women of her time were never permitted to touch. She learned to read a manifest the way other women read a hymnal, front to back and by heart, and she learned, too, the particular quiet dignity of being the person who keeps a business honest when everyone else has stopped paying attention to the details. It was Thomas who used to say, laughing, that she could find a coin in a snowdrift, and it was Thomas who used to say, more seriously, that a person who paid attention to what others overlook would never truly be poor, whatever her purse might say. She held on to that sentence longer than she held on to almost anything else he ever told her, because in the end it would prove itself entirely true, though not in any way either of them could have imagined at the time. Thomas Marsh died of a fever in the winter of 1885, quickly and without warning, and Adeline discovered in the weeks that followed that grief, however deep, does not exempt a widow from the practical cruelties of inheritance law and family resentment. The freight business, though she had built half of it with her own hands and her own ledgers, had been registered entirely in Thomas's name, as was the custom, and upon his death it passed by the terms of an old partnership agreement to his younger brother Corwin, who had contributed money to the business years before but almost none of the labor. Corwin had never much cared for Adeline, resenting, it seemed, the ease with which he had made herself indispensable to his brother, and resenting more the quiet, unspoken suggestion in every room they shared that she understood the business better than he ever would. Within a year of Thomas's death, Corwin had reorganized the company, cut Adeline's small allowance to nothing, and finally, in the cold March of 1887, informed her that the house itself, which he claimed as part of the estate, would need to be sold, and that she would need to find lodging elsewhere. He offered her $11, calling it a generous parting gift, and told her, not unkindly but not kindly either, that a woman of her age and situation ought to consider herself fortunate that he had offered anything at all. She did not argue. She had learned long ago that arguing with men who have already decided what is fair rarely changes the outcome, and only wastes the strength a person needs for what comes next. She packed her tin trunk with what remained of her belongings, her mother's sewing shears, 2 dresses, a small clock that had been a wedding gift, and Thomas's old ledger books, which Corwin had no use for and did not think to take from her, and she left the house she had called home for 9 years without a backward glance that anyone could see, though her heart, if anyone had asked her, was breaking quietly the entire time. She traveled west because west was the direction the coach was going, and because something in her, some stubborn ember she could not quite name, told her that a woman with nothing left to lose might as well go looking for whatever the frontier still had to offer. She came at last to Bitter Fork, a crossroads settlement of perhaps 400 souls, built up around a rail spur that had been meant to become a proper depot until the railroad company changed its plans and routed the main line 30 miles south instead, leaving Bitter Fork to wither slowly on its own vine. The town still had a mercantile, a church, a small schoolhouse, and a saloon that did more business than all 3 combined, but it also had, sitting at the edge of the main road where the old wagon trail used to run before the railroad came through, a large clapboard trading post that had once served every trapper, rancher, and traveler for 50 miles in any direction. It had been built in the 1860s by a man named Ezra Coyle, who had died childless, leaving the post to a nephew who had run it poorly and mortgaged it worse, until the bank in the county seat foreclosed on it in 1881 and simply let it sit, boarded and silent, because no buyer in 6 years had thought it worth the trouble of the taxes owed against it. It was this building, weathered gray, its windows shuttered, its porch sagging on one corner like a tired shoulder, that stood for auction on the courthouse steps the very week Adeline arrived in Bitter Fork with her tin trunk and her $11. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man named Otis Prine, who also happened to serve as the town's part-time notary, read out the terms with visible boredom, noting that the county would forgive the back taxes if anyone would simply take the property off its hands, since the building was worth less standing than it would cost to tear down. A few of the men gathered there, ranchers and merchants who had come for other business entirely, laughed under their breath, and one of them, a heavy-set cattle buyer named Silas Redding, said loud enough for others to hear that a body would have to be a fool or a woman, and he laughed again as if the two were the same thing, to want that old ruin. Adeline stepped forward before she had entirely decided to, and offered her $11, and Otis Prine, too surprised or too indifferent to argue, brought down his gavel and pronounced the trading post-haze. The laughter that followed was not cruel exactly, but it was thorough, and it followed her the half-mile down the road to the building itself, where she stood for a long moment before its door, keys in hand, feeling the whole town's low opinion of her settle over her shoulders like a coat 2 sizes too large. The door stuck badly, swollen with 6 winters of damp, and it took her the better part of an hour with a crowbar borrowed from a mercantile before it finally gave way with a groan, releasing into the spring air a thick breath of dust, mouse nests, and old cedar that had been trapped inside since 1881. Sunlight fell in dusty shafts through gaps in the shuttered windows, illuminating what remained of Ezra Coyle's trading post, rows of empty shelves gone gray with dust, a great iron stove cold and rusted in the corner, coils of ancient rope, a scattering of broken crockery, and, running the length of the back wall, a long counter of dark oak, scarred by decades of use, behind which the old proprietor must once have stood to weigh out flour and measure calico and settle accounts with trappers. Coming down from the high country, Adeline spent her first day simply clearing the debris, sweeping years of dust and vermin leavings out into the yard, propping open the shutters to let the spring light do what it could, and it was on the 3rd day, while she was scrubbing at a grime along the base of that long back counter, that her hand found a seam in the wood that did not belong to any honest joint of carpentry. She knelt and examined it more closely, running her fingers along a nearly invisible line where the panel beneath the counters till drawer met the frame, and she noticed that the wood there, unlike the counters weathered gray elsewhere, still held a faint sheen of oil beneath the dust, as though it had been handled and cared for far more recently and far more deliberately than the rest of the building. She fetched a thin blade from her sewing kit and worked it gently into the seam, and after some minutes of careful, patient effort, the panel came free all at once with a small, dry sound, revealing behind it not the solid wall she expected, but a shallow, hidden compartment built into the very carcass of the counter itself, the kind of concealed space a careful craftsman builds only when he has something worth concealing. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth gone brittle but intact, she found a leather-bound ledger, a small tin box, and a folded map so old the creases had nearly worn through the holes. She carried her find to the one clear patch of counter and unwrapped it with trembling care, and what she found in the ledger, once she had lit a lamp against the fading afternoon and begun to read Ezra Coyle's small, careful hand, was not merely an old man's business account, but something far stranger and far more valuable to the town of Bitterfork than any coin could have been. The ledger recorded, in painstaking detail across nearly 20 years, the trading post dealings not only with trappers and settlers but with the Arapaho and Shoshone families who had traveled through that country long before the crossroads had a name at all, and among the accounts and tallies were press pages of correspondence, records of goods held in trust, and, most remarkably, careful notations of a spring-fed water source on the land north of town, a source Ezra Coyle had mapped and measured and recorded as a true and original water right for the entire valley, a right that had somehow, in the confusion and haste of the town's later founding, been lost, misfiled, or simply forgotten by the county recorders who came after him. The tin box held something smaller but no less significant, a collection of silver coins, not a fortune by any measure but enough to matter greatly to a woman with $11 to her name, along with a brief letter addressed to whoever might one day find his hidden cash, written in Ezra Coyle's own hand and dated the winter before his death. In it he explained that he had grown fearful, in his last years, that the water rights he had painstakingly secured and recorded for the benefit of the whole valley, rights that predated and superseded the competing claims that certain later arrivals of Bitterfork had begun to press, might be lost or stolen after his death by men more interested in profit than in fairness. And so he had hidden the original survey and the ledger recording it here, in the one place he trusted no thief would. Think to look, trusting that whoever eventually came to possess the post honestly would also possess the good sense and good conscience to see the matter set right. Adeline read the letter twice by lamplight, and understood, with a slow and settling certainty, that she was holding in her hands not merely an old man private hoard, but the buried, forgotten truth of an entire community's most essential resource, a truth someone in Bitterfork had very much wanted to stay buried. It did not take her long to understand why. In the days that followed, as she made careful, quiet inquiries of the mercantile and the land office in the county seat, she learned that the very spring Ezra Coyle had documented, the one that fed the creek running down through the whole of the valley and watered every ranch and farm for 10 miles, had for the past decade been claimed and controlled, through a series of filings that struck her as suspiciously convenient, by none other than Silas Redding, the same heavy-set cattle buyer who had laughed at her on the courthouse steps, and whose family had used their claim control of that water to charge grazing and irrigation fees to half the ranches in the valley, fees that had quietly bled small farmers dry for years and driven at least 3 families off their land entirely. When Adeline began, carefully and without accusation, to ask questions about the original survey and the old trading post historical dealings, word reached Silas Redding quickly, as word does in small towns, and he came to see her himself on a gray afternoon in April, standing in the doorway of a half-cleared trading post with his hat still on his head, a discourtesy she noted but did not remark upon. He was, at first, almost pleasant, suggesting in a tone that struck her as rehearsed that whatever old papers she might have found in that ruin of a building was surely worthless, the ramblings of a man long dead and long since irrelevant to how things stood now, and that she would do well, a woman alone with no standing in this town, to leave matters of water and land to men who understood them. When she did not immediately agree, his tone shifted, and he suggested that a woman running a failing trading post with no capital and no allies might find a situation considerably harder if certain people in town decided she was not worth doing business with, a threat delivered so smoothly it might almost have passed for advice. Adeline thanked him for his visit with a composure that cost her more than she let show, and after he left she sat for a long while at Ezra Coyle's old counter, the ledger open before her, and made her decision. She would not go to the county recorder alone and unsupported, where a filing could easily be lost or delayed by men loyal to Redding's interests. Instead, she would do what she had learned to do at her father's counter and beside Widow Pruitt's fire so many years before, which was to gather quiet, overlooked people, and let the truth, carefully assembled, speak for itself. She spent the following weeks reopening the trading post and owners, not merely as a shop but as a gathering place, offering fair prices and honest scales to ranchers who had grown accustomed to being cheated by the one mercantile in town that answered to Redding's cousin. And slowly, cautiously, the valley's smaller farmers began to trust her enough to talk. She listened to a widow named Hetty Voss, no relation, who had lost 40 acres to unpaid irrigation fees 3 years before. She listened to an old trapper named Jonas Blackfeather, whose grandmother had traded with Ezra Coyle in the trading post's earliest years and who confirmed, from his own family's memory, that the spring had always been understood as common water, free to any who worked the valley, until the Reddings arrived and began charging for it. She copied Ezra Coyle's survey by lamplight, checked its measurement against the land itself with the help of Jonas, who knew every fold of that country, and found that the old man's markers still stood, moss-grown stones of the spring's true source, exactly as his ledger described. Piece by piece, she built not merely a claim but a case, and when she finally rode to the county seat, it was not alone. It was with Hetty Voss and Jonas Blackfeather and 2 other ranching families beside her, each carrying their own memory and their own grievance, presenting to the recorder a united record impossible to dismiss as one bitter widow's fantasy. The county recorder, a cautious man named Whitfield who had no particular loyalty to Redding but also no particular courage, took the matter under advisement for nearly a month, during which time Redding's cousin, the mercantile, spread word that Adeline Marsh was stirring up trouble that would ruin the whole town's peace. And for a time it seemed the town might simply close ranks around the man everyone had grown used to fearing rather than the woman nobody yet trusted. But Adeline had learned patience from a lifetime of being underestimated, and she did not press or plead. She simply kept her trading post open, kept her scales honest, kept Ezra Coyle's ledger available for any who wished to see it with their own eyes, and let the plain, dry, undeniable weight of the old man's careful handwriting do the work that no amount of arguing could have done. It was Jonas Blackfeather who finally tipped the matter, testifying before the county board that his family had watered their stock of that spring since before Bitterfork had name, and that Redding's claim, filed only in 1879, could not by any honest reckoning supersede a right recorded 15 years earlier by the town's own founding trader. Faced with Ezra Coyle's original survey, the corroborating memory of the valley's oldest families, and the plain fact that Redding's filing had quietly and conveniently overlapped ground he had no earlier claim to, Whitfield ruled, at last, that the spring and its water were to be restored as common right to the valley, exactly as Ezra Coyle had always intended. Silas Redding did not go quietly, and for a time he threatened lawsuits and spoke darkly of appeals, but the ruling held, and more damaging to him than the ruling itself was a plain fact, now known to every rancher in the valley, that he had for a decade collected fees on water that had never rightfully been his to sell. Families he had overcharged again quietly demanding accounting. The bank that held his own loans grew nervous at the sudden scrutiny, and within 2 years Redding had sold off the greater part of his holdings and left Bitterfork altogether, moving on, it was said, to try his hand at similar schemes in a territory where his name was not yet known, though Adeline never took any particular satisfaction in his ruin, understanding, as her mother had once taught her, that justice was best served, plain and without gloating. What mattered far more to her than Redding's downfall was what came after. The spring ran free again for every farm in the valley. 3 families who had lost land to unpaid fees were, through a fund Adeline helped organize using Ezra Coyle's small hoard of silver as its first contribution, able to reclaim what they had lost, and the old trading post itself, rebuilt board by board with the help of neighbors who had once laughed at her purchase, became once more what it had been in Ezra Coyle's day. The true heart of Bitterfork, a place where a person's word and a fair scale mattered more than the size of their purse. It is worth remembering, now, how this story began. A woman of 41, cast out with $11 in a tin trunk, buying for the price of a week's meals of ruin that an entire town had judged not worth the trouble of tearing down. Adeline Marsh never forgot the sound of that laughter on the courthouse steps, and she never forgot, either, the lesson her mother had taught her at Widow Pruitt's fire so many years before, that a thing's worth is rarely what the crowd believes it to be, and that the people and places the world writes off are so very often the ones holding, quietly and patiently, exactly what everyone else has lost. Ezra Coyle had hidden his ledger behind that counter not out of greed but out of faith. Faith that someday someone honest would find it and know what to do, and Adeline had honored that faith not by keeping the silver for herself, though heaven knows she had needed it, but by using it to knit back together a community that had slowly come apart at the seams without ever quite noticing the tear. What waited behind that counter did shock the whole of Bitterfork, not because it made one widow rich, though in time her trading post did prosper modestly and honestly, but because it restored to 400 people the plain, essential truth that had been stolen from them so quietly they had almost forgotten it was ever theirs to begin with. Thank you for spending this time with Adeline Marsh in the town of Bitterfork tonight. If her story moved you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need reminding that what looks like ruin from the outside can hold, quietly, everything a person or a place has been waiting for. We'd love to know, in the comment below, what is a time you found real value in something the world had already written off, a home, an object, or perhaps even yourself. Take care of one another, and take care of the overlooked corners of your own life. Until next time, stay close.